Greetings, intrepid listeners, and welcome back to Quiet Corners of Forgotten History. Tonight we cast off, sailing into the unforgiven, icy embrace of reality. Vikings in Greenland. Forget horned helmets, picture stubbornness against brutal cold, dwindling resources, and a slow, agonizing fade into oblivion. Being a Viking here wasn't glorious, it was a frozen nightmare. If this frosty dive into hardship helps you unwind, consider a gentle like and subscribe. It helps us continue these quiet expeditions. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, and let's journey into Greenland's forgotten saga. Our story begins not in Greenland, but in Iceland, during the late 10th century. Imagine a land already settled by Norsemen, a place that once seemed vast, but was now feeling full. The best farmlands were claimed, disputes over resources flared up like embers in the wind, and a sense of restlessness permeated the air. For many, Iceland was no longer the land of opportunity it once was. The sagas tell of feuds and hardships, of a society where a man's fortune and sometimes his life could hang by a thread. It was a time ripe for a new promise, a new horizon, however distant or daunting it might seem. Into this restless landscape steps one of history's more infamous figures, and perhaps its first great, albeit misleading, real estate agent, Eiríkur Thorvaldsson, better known as Eirik the Red. His fiery red hair and beard were matched by a temperament that often landed him in trouble. Accused of manslaughter not once but twice, Eirik found himself an outlaw, banished first from Norway and then, crucially, from Iceland. Facing a 3-year exile, Eirik wasn't one to sit idle. He had heard whispers, old sailors' tales of a vast landmass lying to the west, sighted decades earlier but never explored. With little left for him in Iceland, he set sail towards the unknown. In the year 982, Eirik and his crew navigated the treacherous North Atlantic, dodging icebergs and enduring biting winds. They found land, just as the tales had promised. For 3 years, Eirik meticulously explored this new territory. He discovered fjords that cut deep into the land, flanked by towering mountains. But crucially, along some of these fjords, he found patches of green, meadows and valleys that, during the brief, intense summer, offered a semblance of pasture. He saw the potential, or perhaps he chose to see the potential. This wasn't just a landmass, it was, in his eyes, a future, a place to start anew, far from his troubles. Eirik's exile ended, and he returned to Iceland not as a humbled outlaw, but as a visionary. He knew that convincing others to follow him to this remote, largely icy land would require a masterstroke of persuasion. He needed a name that evoked promise, fertility, and hope, not ice and rock. And so he called it Greenland. Men would be more readily persuaded thither, the sagas tell us, if the land had a good name. It was a brilliant, if deceptive, piece of marketing. He painted pictures not of the overwhelming ice sheet, but of those coastal green patches, exaggerating their extent and potential. Why would people risk everything based on the word of an exiled killer and a promising name? Because the push factors in Iceland were strong. As we mentioned, land was scarce. Ambitious young men saw little chance to establish their own farms. Families struggled. The legal system could be harsh, and feuds could make life untenable. Eirik's proposition, however embellished, offered something invaluable. A chance to own land, to be a founder, to escape old quarrels, and to build a new life in a place untouched by the pressures that squeezed them in Iceland. The dream of independence was a powerful lure. The pull was equally potent, built upon Eirik's carefully crafted narrative. He spoke of rich pastures, abundant fishing, and hunting grounds teeming with seals, walrus, and perhaps even caribou. He likely described the long summer days, conveniently downplaying the endless, dark winters. He offered not just land, but a community, a fresh start built on Norse traditions but free from Iceland's constraints. For those feeling trapped or disenfranchised, Greenland sounded less like an icy rock and more like a rugged paradise, a place where Viking self-sufficiency and resilience could truly flourish. It was a compelling vision. In 1985, the dream set sail. A fleet of 25 ships carrying hundreds of men, women, and children, along with their livestock and a few precious belongings, departed Iceland for Greenland. The journey itself was a harsh preview of what lay ahead. The North Atlantic is rarely kind. Storms scattered the fleet. Ice was a constant threat. Of the 25 ships that set out, only 14 are believed to have reached their destination. It was a perilous beginning, a filtering process where only the luckiest or perhaps the most stubborn made it through. The dream was already being tested against the unforgiving reality of the sea. And what of their arrival? Those 14 ships found the fjords Eirik had described. They established 2 main settlements, the eastern settlement, where Eirik himself lived, and the smaller western settlement further north. And yes, in the summer there was green. but it was a fragile, fleeting green, clinging precariously to the edges of an immense, overwhelming expanse of ice. The growing season was brutally short. The winters were longer and colder than anything they had known in Iceland. The Greenland they had been promised was, for most of the year and across most of its territory, a land of white. The dream had met the drift ice. The decision was made. Spurred by Eric's promises and pushed by the constraints of Iceland, hundreds of families packed their meager belongings. They gathered at the fjords, their faces a mixture of hope and trepidation. The dream of Greenland had been sown, but before it could even attempt to take root, it had to survive the journey. They were about to embark upon one of the most dangerous sea crossings known to them, a voyage into the vast gray emptiness of the North Atlantic, a brutal passage to uncertainty. They wouldn't travel in the sleek, fearsome longships often pictured in raids. For colonization, the Norse relied on a different vessel, the Gnar. These were sturdy, wide-beamed cargo ships, built for capacity rather than speed. Imagine a broad, rounded hull, perhaps 50 feet long, constructed from overlapping wooden planks sealed with tar and animal hair. They were primarily powered by a single, large, square sail with only a few oars for maneuvering in calm conditions or close to shore. They were reliable but slow and cumbersome. More importantly, the Gnar was largely an open boat. While there might have been small, covered sections at the bow and stern, most of the vessel was exposed to the elements. There were no cabins, no bunks, no galleys. People, animals, tools, seeds, and provisions were all crammed together in this open space. Picture families huddled under high tarps, shielding themselves from rain and spray, surrounded by bleating sheep, lowing cattle, and the few precious tools they hoped would build their future. Loading these ships was a monumental task. Every inch mattered. They carried the essentials: iron pots, woodworking axes, knives, weaving looms, and fishing gear. They brought seeds for barley, though they couldn't know how poorly it would grow. They brought livestock, the foundation of their farming dreams: sheep, goats, perhaps a few precious cows. These animals needed fodder and water for a journey of unknown length, adding immense bulk and weight. It was a floating, fragile, and overstuffed ark. The people themselves were a cross-section of Icelandic society, not just hardened sailors, but farmers, craftspeople, women, and children. They were families casting their lot together, neighbors following neighbors. They carried the weight of their past and the fragile seed of their future. As they watched the shores of Iceland, their home, sink below the horizon, a profound sense of isolation must have settled upon them. Ahead lay nothing but gray water and a whispered promise. How did they find their way across hundreds of miles of open, often featureless ocean? Norse navigation was a blend of skill, experience, and keen observation. They used the sun, perhaps with a simple sun compass, to gauge latitude. At night, the stars provided guidance, though clouds and fog often obscured them. They understood the patterns of waves, the direction of winds, and the flight paths of birds. They might have followed migrating whales, but much of it relied on a dead reckoning, a skilled guess, and a heavy dose of luck. Days turned into nights, and nights blurred into days. The sheer scale of the North Atlantic is hard to comprehend. Imagine being in a small wooden bowl, tossed on an endless, rolling expanse of gray-green water. The horizon is a constant, empty circle. The sky above is often a blanket of cloud. The sense of being utterly alone, a tiny speck in an indifferent wilderness, would have been overwhelming. Time loses its meaning, replaced only by the rhythm of the waves and the howl of the wind. The North Atlantic is notorious for its storms. Without warning, the skies could darken, the wind could rise to a terrifying shriek, and the waves could swell into moving mountains of water. The Gnar, though sturdy, would be tossed about like a toy. Waves would crash over the sides, drenching everyone and everything, filling the bottom of the boat with frigid water that had to be bailed out endlessly. Holding on, simply surviving the onslaught, took every ounce of strength. Just as dangerous as the storms, perhaps more insidious, was the fog. The North Atlantic is prone to dense, chilling banks of fog that can roll in and swallow everything. Visibility drops to near zero. Ships traveling in a fleet could easily become separated, each one suddenly alone in a disorienting white void. The fog amplified the cold, the dampness seeped into bones, and the silence, broken only by the creak of timber and the drip of water, played on the nerves. Cold was a constant companion, an unwelcome passenger on every Gnar. Even in the heart of summer, the North Atlantic air carries a biting chill, and the water is unforgivingly frigid. Dressed in woolen tunics, leggings, and heavy cloaks, the settlers would have found their garments frequently soaked through by sea spray, rain, and crashing waves. Wool retained some warmth when wet, but the pervasive dampness, combined with the wind, created a relentless drain on body heat. Huddled together under hide tarps, sleep would have been fitful, a shallow escape punctuated by shivers and the deep ache of cold settling into their bones. Hypothermia was a real and present danger, silently weakening the body and dulling the mind. And then there was the ice. As they neared Greenland, they entered the realm of icebergs. These silent, white mountains drift south from the Arctic, often shrouded in mist. They posed a catastrophic threat. A collision, especially at night or in fog, would mean certain doom, shattering the wooden hull and plunging everyone into lethally cold water. Lookouts had to be posted constantly, straining their eyes for the telltale glint of ice, shouting warnings to the helmsman. Life aboard was a grim ordeal of endurance. The space was incredibly cramped. Imagine dozens of people sharing a space no larger than a small room, with no walls and a perpetually moving floor. Movement was difficult and often perilous. Basic sanitation was non-existent, leading to an environment ripe for discomfort and disease. The diet was monotonous and meager: dried fish, perhaps some smoked meat, hardtack biscuits, and maybe skyr, a soured milk product that traveled relatively well. Fresh water, stored in barrels, was strictly rationed and always tasted stale. The constant dampness encouraged mold and rot, and the air itself would have been thick, a potent mix of unwashed bodies, seasickness, livestock, and stagnant bilge water. The animals suffered too. Confined, often stressed and battered by the waves, they added to the chaos. Keeping them fed and watered was a challenge. Their cries would have mingled with the sounds of the sea and the groans of the settlers. If an animal fell sick or died, it was a significant loss, a blow to the future farm they dreamed of. Their presence made an already difficult journey even more complex and uncomfortable. In these crowded, unsanitary, and stressful conditions, sickness could spread like wildfire. The close proximity meant that a simple cough or sniffle could easily pass from one person to the next, potentially turning into life-threatening pneumonia in the damp, cold air. Stomach ailments, almost inevitable due to questionable food and water quality, could quickly lead to debilitating dehydration. There was no doctor, no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory. Care was limited to folk remedies, prayers, and the support of family. The weak, the elderly, and the very young were especially vulnerable, their bodies less able to withstand the combined assault of hardship and illness. Many souls likely found their final resting place in the cold depths long before they ever saw Greenland. We know from the sagas that Eric's pioneering fleet suffered greatly. Of the 25 ships that set out with such hope, only 14 reached Greenland. Nearly half were lost. Some were likely smashed by storms, others crushed by ice. Some may simply have been blown so far off course that they could never find their way back or reach land before their supplies ran out. It's a stark reminder that this voyage was a deadly gamble, a filter that claimed many lives. For those 14 ships, imagine the moment after weeks of gray sea and white fear, when a dark line appeared on the horizon. Land, not the lush green paradise of Eric's tales perhaps, but something solid: towering mountains, deep fjords, and yes, hints of green along the coast. The relief must have been immense, but it would have been tinged with exhaustion and apprehension. They had survived the journey. Now they faced the immense challenge of surviving Greenland itself. The surviving ships, battered but intact, navigated carefully through the maze of islands and skerries, pushing deeper into the long, winding fjords that cut into Greenland's coast. The high rock walls offered immediate shelter from the relentless Atlantic winds, and the water within the fjords was calmer. For a moment, it felt like reaching a sanctuary. These fjords were majestic in a severe and imposing way. Imagine sheer cliffs of ancient rock, scraped bare by glaciers, plunging directly into deep, dark water. Waterfalls, fed by the melting ice above, cascaded down these walls, their distant roar echoing in the stillness. The scale was immense, dwarfing the small wooden ships. This was a landscape carved by giants, and the Norse were but tiny intruders in its vastness. Guided by Eric's descriptions, they sought out the inner reaches of these fjords, and there, as promised, they found green. Patches of land nestled between the mountains and the sea glowed with a vibrant, if short-lived, summer color. It wasn't the deep, lush green of European meadows, but a thinner, more fragile tapestry of grasses, sedges, mosses, and low-lying shrubs like willow and birch, a classic tundra landscape. During these first summer months, the Arctic light played its own deceptive tricks. The sun barely dipped below the horizon, bathing the landscape in an almost continuous ethereal glow for nearly 24 hours a day. This endless daylight fueled a frantic burst of plant growth and must have filled the settlers with an initial, if fleeting, sense of optimism. It felt like a time of bounty, a land of endless opportunity under the midnight sun. Yet this fragile green band was just that, a thin ribbon clinging to the coast. Whenever a settler climbed one of the surrounding hills for a better view, the true nature of Greenland revealed itself. Beyond the coastal fringe, as far as the eye could see, lay the Inlandis, the great Greenland ice sheet, a colossal, shimmering white desert, a silent, frozen heart that dominated the island and dictated its climate. It was a constant, chilling reminder of where they truly were. The best spots, those precious inner-fjord areas with the most promising green patches, were quickly claimed. Eric, as the leader, established his own farm, Bratalid, in what would become the eastern settlement. Other families followed his lead, choosing sites near freshwater streams with access to pasture land and the sea. They spaced themselves out, each family needing a considerable area just to hope for enough grazing. Then came the arduous task of unloading. Down narrow ramps or simply wading through the frigid shallows came the exhausted, wobbly-legged livestock. Cows, sheep, goats, and perhaps a few horses blinked in the strange light, their hooves sinking into unfamiliar ground. Boxes, barrels, tools, and personal effects were hauled ashore. Every item represented a vital link to their old lives and a crucial tool for building a new one. Setting foot on solid ground felt like a victory, but the real work was just beginning. Shelter was the immediate priority. There were no forests to provide timber for grand longhouses. Instead, they turned to the materials at hand, stone and turf. They cut thick blocks of the tough, root-matted turf and laid them over stone foundations, creating low, thick-walled structures. These first homes were likely small, damp, and dark, burrowed partly into the earth for insulation, offering basic protection against the elements. A first foothold in an alien land. As they began to explore their claimed lands more closely, the settlers started to truly assess the farming potential. They walked the green areas, kicking at the ground, examining the vegetation. While the summer growth looked promising from afar, a closer inspection revealed the harsh truth. This wasn't the deep, rich loam of their homelands. This was something far more challenging. The soil was incredibly thin, often just a few inches deep, lying directly over gravel, sand, or solid bedrock. It was fragile and lacked the rich organic matter needed for intensive agriculture. In many places, just beneath this thin layer lay permafrost, permanently frozen ground that chilled the soil above and prevented deep root growth. It was a marginal foundation upon which to build an agricultural dream. Compounding the soil issue was the growing season. The endless summer days were matched by an equally long, dark, and bitterly cold winter. The window for plant growth was incredibly short, perhaps only 3 or 4 months at the very most, and even then temperatures could plummet unexpectedly. They had to work with frantic urgency, a constant race against the approaching cold to sow, grow, and harvest. What could they even hope to grow here? They brought barley seeds, a staple in their old homes, but barley struggled in Greenland. Only in the most sheltered spots, during the very warmest years, could they hope for a meager harvest. Attempts at growing other vegetables likely met with similar, limited success. It became clear very quickly that arable farming, growing crops for human food, was not going to be the mainstay here. The real crucial crop was hay. Their entire farming system, their survival, depended on keeping their livestock alive through the long, dark winter. This meant cutting and drying every possible blade of grass from the limited meadows during the short summer. Haymaking was a monumental, all-consuming task. A poor hay harvest meant a devastating winter, a choice between slaughtering precious livestock or watching them starve. A profound shock for these Norse settlers was the almost complete lack of trees. In Norway, and even Iceland, wood was a fundamental resource for building, tool-making, shipbuilding, and fuel. In Greenland, there were no forests, only stunted, gnarled birch and willow, barely suitable for small fires. Their primary source of wood became driftwood, logs washed ashore, carried by currents from Siberia or North America. It was a precious, unreliable, and finite resource. One thing the landscape offered in abundance was fresh water. Countless streams and rivers, milky with glacial silt, tumbled down from the ice cap and mountains. Small lakes dotted the landscape, but this water was almost always icy cold, a constant reminder of its glacial origins. While essential for life, it offered little comfort in the chilly air. The land held some wildlife, though it was often sparse and wary. They might have seen Arctic hares, their coats changing with the seasons, and the elusive Arctic fox. Further inland, herds of caribou or reindeer roamed. These offered a potential source of meat and hides, but hunting them required skill, time, and journeys away from the homesteads. They were a supplement, not a staple. It was the sea that held the real promise of sustenance. The fjords and coastal waters teemed with life. Seals were abundant, providing meat, blubber for oil, and waterproof skins. Walrus further north offered valuable ivory tusks for trade. Whales occasionally passed by or became stranded, and fish, like Arctic char and cod, could be caught. But accessing these resources meant braving the cold waters in small boats, a constant risk. The soundscape, too, was alien. Gone were the sounds of deep forests or bustling villages. Here, the dominant sounds were the sighing and sometimes roaring of the wind funneling through the fjords, the sharp crack of calving ice from nearby glaciers, the distant thunder of icebergs rolling in the sea, and the cries of countless seabirds nesting on the cliffs. It was a world both loud with nature's power and profoundly silent of human presence. This immense, raw landscape instilled a sense of scale that could be both awe-inspiring and deeply unsettling. The mountains weren't gentle hills. They were towering, ancient rock faces. The ice wasn't a winter feature. It was a permanent, crushing presence. The sea wasn't just a route. It was a vast, powerful force. Humans felt small here, their newly built turf houses like tiny burrows in the face of overwhelming natural forces. Even as they toiled under the summer sun, making hay and building homes, the thought of the coming winter must have been a constant, nagging presence. Every decision, every action, was geared towards preparing for the long months of darkness and cold. How much hay was enough? How much dried fish? How secure was the shelter? The first winter would be the ultimate test of their preparation and resilience. It was here, standing on the thin soil, looking out at the ice-choked fjords and the looming ice cap, that the full weight of Eric's Greenland moniker must have struck them. Perhaps it was meant as an encouragement, a hope. But standing there, feeling the chill wind even in summer, it must have felt like a bitter irony. This land was many things, stark, beautiful, challenging, dangerous, but overwhelmingly green it was not. Yet there was no easy way back. The journey had been too perilous, too costly. They had invested everything they had, their wealth, their energy, their hopes, and the lives of those lost at sea, in reaching this shore. They were committed. This strange, harsh, and not-so-green land was now their home, and their survival depended entirely on their ability to adapt, to endure, and to wring a living from its unforgiving grasp. The first impression was a sobering one, a stark awakening from the dream. The Norse settlers in Greenland, having survived the voyage and faced the stark reality of their new home, turned their attention to a task of monumental proportions: building. Not just temporary shelters, but enduring homes, farms, and places of worship. In a land offering few familiar comforts and even fewer easy resources, every structure erected would be a testament to immense, back-breaking, and relentless toil. The first step was choosing the precise spot for a farmstead. This involved more than just finding a patch of green. They needed shelter from the katabatic winds that swept down from the ice cap, a reliable source of fresh water, and, crucially, nearby access to the only building materials available in abundance: stone and turf. Finding a location that balanced all these needs was the first challenge in a long series. We must constantly remember the overwhelming constraint they faced: the near-total absence of trees. Forget log cabins or timber-framed halls. Every building plan had to be adapted to this reality. The precious, scarce driftwood was hoarded for roof beams, doors, and internal fittings, but the core structures, the walls themselves, had to come from the earth and the rock. Stone was foundational. Greenland offered plenty of it, but gathering and working it was arduous. They sought out loose stones from glacial moraines or riverbeds, or when necessary, quarried rock faces using fire-setting wedges and brute force. Each stone, often weighing hundreds of pounds, had to be moved, lifted, and positioned by human muscle, often in freezing temperatures where the rock bit deep into cold hands. The second key material was turf. This wasn't just loose earth, it was the thick, tough mat of grass, roots, and soil that formed the tundra's surface. Using long-handled turf spades, they would cut heavy blocks, often several feet long and a foot thick. These blocks were surprisingly durable and offered excellent insulation, but they were heavy, damp, and required skill to stack effectively. Their tools were simple but essential. Iron axes, hammers, chisels, and spades were among their most prized possessions, likely brought from Iceland or Norway. These tools faced constant wear and tear against the hard rock and tough turf. Sharpening them was a constant chore, and a broken tool was a serious setback. There were no engines, no cranes, no power, only muscle, leverage, and ingenuity. Construction began with the foundations. Often they would dig down slightly, either to find a more stable base or to embed the structure partly into the earth for added insulation and stability. Then came the heavy work of laying the base course, selecting the largest, flattest stones and painstakingly maneuvering them into place, creating a solid platform upon which the walls would rise. The walls themselves were often a composite, but stone formed the skeleton, They used a dry stone technique, carefully selecting and fitting stones together without mortar or sometimes using a sticky clay, if available, as a binding agent. Lifting heavy stones shoulder high or higher required immense coordination and strength. It was slow, dangerous work where a single misstep could lead to serious injury. Between or outside the stone courses, they laid the turf blocks. These were stacked like giant bricks, often with an inner and outer layer, sometimes with an insulating gap in between. The turf added bulk and, most importantly, insulation. It transformed a cold stone shell into something potentially habitable, though it brought its own issues of dampness and a distinctly earthy aroma. The resulting houses evolved into a distinct Greenlandic longhouse style. They were typically long and narrow, often with multiple rooms joined end to end under one long roof. Walls were incredibly thick, sometimes 6 feet or more, creating deep window and door reveals. These buildings huddled close to the ground, presenting a low profile to the fierce winds. Roofing was perhaps the greatest architectural challenge. Lacking long, strong timbers, they had to improvise. They used their precious driftwood, sometimes supplemented with whale ribs or large flat stones, to create a basic A-frame or ridge structure. Over this, they laid layers of smaller branches, if available, turf and perhaps birch bark, creating a heavy, insulating but perpetually leaky roof. Inside, these longhouses were dark and often smoky. Floors were typically packed earth, perhaps covered with flat stones or animal hides. Low benches, often made of stone and covered with wood or furs, ran along the walls, serving as seats by day and beds by night. Light came from small, often unglazed openings, or from the flickering flames of the central hearth and soapstone oil lamps. Insulation was paramount. The thick turf walls were the first line of defense. Burying the houses partly in the ground helped. Having multiple rooms, often with stone partitions and low doorways, created airlocks and reduced drafts. Livestock byres were frequently attached directly to the human dwelling, their body heat providing a vital, if pungent, source of warmth. Imagine the physical act of building in this environment. Try swinging a heavy hammer when your fingers are numb with cold. Picture hoisting a heavy turf block while a biting wind tries to push you off balance. Consider the short winter days when only a few hours of usable light were available. Every action required more effort, more endurance than it would in a gentler climate. Beyond the main longhouse, other structures were needed. Byres, or cowsheds, had to be built, large enough to house the precious cattle and sheep through 7 or 8 months of winter. These, too, were thick-walled stone and turf structures, often linked to the main house. Barns were essential, built to protect the vital winter hay supply from wind, snow, and damp. To manage their livestock and protect their hay meadows from grazing animals, they built extensive stone walls, or dikes. Miles of these low, sturdy walls crisscrossed the landscape around the farms. This represented yet another monumental investment in labor. Countless hours spent gathering, hauling, and stacking stones one by one across the rugged terrain. As the settlements grew, so did the need for communal buildings, most notably churches. These were often the most ambitious construction projects. Built primarily of stone, sometimes with imported timber for the roof and features, they stood as symbols of faith and community identity. Their ruins today, like the one at Halsey, are powerful reminders of the settlers' determination and skill. It's difficult to overstate the sheer physical exertion involved. Every stone in every wall, every block of turf, every piece of driftwood, every whalebone was moved, shaped, and placed by human hands. It was a constant battle against gravity and the elements. Generations lived lives defined by this relentless physical struggle, building and rebuilding their small world. Establishing a farmstead wasn't a summer project. It was the work of years, even decades. The first settlers built small and basic structures. Over time, as families grew and resources allowed, they expanded, added rooms, built higher walls, and constructed more outbuildings. The Greenlandic farms we see in ruins today are the result of centuries of cumulative effort. And the work was never truly finished. The harsh climate took a constant toll. Frost heave shifted foundations, wind and rain eroded turf walls, roofs slumped under heavy snow and inevitably leaked. Constant maintenance was a fact of life. Patching walls, re-roofing, shoring up structures. These were annual chores, an ongoing fight against the slow decay and the power of nature. When we look at the remains of these Norse settlements today, the low green mounds outlining longhouses, the skeletal stone walls of a church, it's easy to see them simply as ruins, but we should try to see them as monuments. Monuments to unimaginable resilience, to backbreaking labor, and to a profound centuries-long effort to carve a European life into an Arctic landscape. These stone and turf structures were more than just shelter. They were anchors, points of stability in a vast and often overwhelming world. They were expressions of a culture trying to replicate its traditions in a new land. Each one represented a victory, however temporary, in the endless struggle against the cold, the wind, and the fundamental limitations of Greenland itself. Once the first rough shelters were built and the land was claimed, the most fundamental, pressing, and enduring challenge of life in Greenland took center stage: finding enough food. Day in, day out, year after year, the lives of the Norse settlers revolved around the relentless quest for sustenance. It was a precarious balance, a constant negotiation with a land that offered its bounty grudgingly and often with great peril. The agricultural dream, the promise of green pastures that lured them across the ocean, quickly met its icy reality. Yes, they were farmers by tradition, but Greenland pushed that tradition to its absolute limit. As we've seen, the soil was thin, the growing season was a fleeting whisper between long winters, and the types of crops they could even attempt were few. Farming here would never be easy. It would be a constant, marginal struggle. Their livestock, cows, sheep, and goats, were their most precious link to their farming heritage. Yet these animals were not primarily raised for meat. Killing a cow was a significant decision, usually reserved for emergencies or special feasts. Instead, they were valued for renewable resources: milk, which was turned into butter, cheese, and the soured milk product, skyr, and wool, essential for clothing in the harsh climate. But these animals too faced the food crisis. Their survival depended entirely on the settlers' ability to provide fodder through the winter, which often lasted 8 months. This meant that the brief summer became a frantic race to cut and dry hay from every available meadow. The success or failure of the hay harvest directly determined how many animals, and by extension, how many people, could survive the coming winter. Attempts to grow grains like barley, a staple back home, were largely disappointing. While some yields might have been achieved in the warmest microclimates during the early milder centuries of settlement, it was never reliable. Small vegetable gardens might have supplemented the diet with hardy greens or roots for a short period, but they could never form the core of their food supply. The European farming model simply didn't fit. Increasingly, the Norse had to turn away from the land and towards the sea. The single most important source of food became the seal. These marine mammals, particularly the harp and ringed seals, were abundant in the fjords and coastal waters. Hunting them became a critical skill, likely involving small boats, harpoons, nets set under the ice. Nothing from a seal was wasted. The meat provided essential protein and fat. The thick layer of blubber was rendered down into oil, which fueled their soapstone lamps, the only source of light during the long winter darkness, and could also be eaten. The skins were vital, used for waterproof clothing, sturdy boots, ropes, and perhaps even covering for their small boats. The seal was, in many ways, life itself. Further out, or further north, lay another prize, the walrus. These enormous creatures were hunted primarily for their long, dense ivory tusks, which were the most valuable export from Greenland, their link to the European economy. But a successful walrus hunt also provided a huge amount of meat and blubber. However, hunting walruses was exceptionally dangerous work, requiring long voyages and confrontations with powerful animals. Whales, too, offered a potential bonanza. While it's unlikely the Greenland Norse actively hunted large whales in the way the later Basque or Inuit did, they certainly took advantage of stranded whales. A single whale washed ashore could provide tons of meat and blubber, a massive, albeit unpredictable, boost to the larder that could mean the difference between survival and starvation for a community. Fish, surprisingly, seem to have played a less central role than one might expect, though they were still important. Arctic char, a type of salmon, could be caught in rivers and lakes, and cod or halibut might have been fished in the fjords. They were likely caught using lines, nets, or traps, and often dried for storage. While a valuable supplement, archaeological evidence suggests they weren't the primary focus, perhaps due to a focus on seal hunting. On land, the main target was the caribou, or wild reindeer. Herds roamed the interior highlands, especially in summer. Hunting them meant long, arduous treks away from the coastal farms, deep into rugged terrain. A successful caribou hunt provided lean meat, valuable hides for clothing and bedding, and antlers for tools and crafts. But like the whales, their presence was seasonal and not always reliable. Smaller game and birds filled in the gaps. Arctic hares and ptarmigan offered occasional fresh meat. During the summer, the vast seabird colonies on the coastal cliffs provided a rich harvest of eggs and birds. These were likely gathered during risky climbs on the sheer rock faces, a small but important addition to a limited diet. Every calorie counted. Every hunting or fishing expedition carried immense risk. Venturing out onto the winter sea ice meant facing treacherous cracks, shifting flows, and sudden blizzards. Small boats in the fjords could be swamped by sudden storms or caught by calving icebergs. Hunters on land could get lost in fog, fall, or, though rarely, encounter a polar bear. Starvation was a constant threat, but so was the danger inherent in trying to prevent it. With such unpredictable and seasonal resources, food preservation was not just important, it was essential for survival. Meat and fish were air-dried in the cold, dry wind, or sometimes smoked if enough fuel could be spared. Salting was difficult due to the scarcity of salt. Fermentation was another method. Food was stored in stone-lined pits dug into the cold ground or in small, well-built stone storehouses designed to keep out scavengers. Then came the winter. Imagine months of near-total darkness, deep snow, and biting cold. Trapped inside their dim, smoky longhouses, the settlers relied entirely on the food they had managed to gather and preserve during the brief summer. Day by day, they watched their stores dwindle. Every meal was a calculation, a balance between immediate need and future survival. Inevitably, there were lean times. The late winter and early spring, before the seals returned in force or the first green sheets appeared, was likely a period known as the hunger gap. Stored food ran low. People grew weak. Malnutrition would have made them more susceptible to disease. Sagas sometimes speak of famine, a grim reality lurking beneath the surface of everyday life. Even when food was available, the diet was often monotonous and likely lacked certain key nutrients. While rich in protein and fat, it was poor in carbohydrates, from the lack of grain, and for much of the year desperately short of vitamins found in fresh fruits and vegetables. Over generations, this could have had significant long-term impacts on health, bone density, and resilience. Superimposed on this already challenging situation were climate fluctuations. The Norse arrived during the medieval warm period, but later centuries saw the onset of the Little Ice Age. Colder temperatures meant shorter growing seasons, less hay, and struggling livestock. It also meant changes in sea ice patterns, which could affect seal migration and make hunting more difficult or dangerous. The narrow margins for survival grew even narrower. It's interesting to note that as the Norse struggled, another group, the Thule people, who ancestors of the modern Inuit, were thriving in Greenland. They possessed a culture and technology perfectly adapted to the Arctic environment, with sophisticated sea mammal hunting techniques, dog sleds, and skin boats. The Norse, by contrast, remained tied to their European farming model, adapting, but perhaps never fully enough. How food was shared or controlled likely played a role in social dynamics. Chieftains and larger farmers probably had greater stores, offering some security but also creating obligations and power imbalances. Communal hunts or the sharing of a stranded whale would have reinforced community bonds, but periods of scarcity could also lead to tension and conflict over dwindling resources. Imagine the constant low-level anxiety that must have pervaded daily life. Would the seals come this year? Would the summer be warm enough for a good hay harvest? Would the hunters return safely? Would the stored food last until spring? This psychological burden, the ever-present fear of hunger, was as much a part of the Greenlandic experience as the cold itself. Ultimately, the struggle for food was the central drama of Norse Greenland. It dictated where they lived, how they built their homes, how they spent their days, and how they interacted with each other and their environment. It was a relentless, grinding challenge that, despite centuries of effort, grew ever harder, casting a long, cold shadow over the fate of this remote European outpost. For centuries, the Norse Greenlanders had clung tenaciously to the edge of their harsh world. They had built homes from stone and turf, raised families under an often gray sky, tended their precious livestock, and hunted the icy seas. They had endured hardships, known the gnawing pains of hunger, and buried their dead in the frozen ground. Life was never easy, but through sheer, stubborn resilience and adaptation they had persisted. But now an invisible, inexorable force began to creep across their land, a change they couldn't fight, couldn't bargain with, couldn't understand, and ultimately couldn't withstand. Their arrival, back in the late 10th century, had coincided with a period geologists call the medieval warm period. This wasn't a tropical heat wave, but it meant that, for a time, conditions in the North Atlantic were relatively milder. Sea ice was less extensive, summers were just warm enough, and growing seasons, while short, were just long enough to make their precarious farming model possible. It gave them a foothold. But around the end of the 13th century and intensifying significantly into the 14th, things began to change. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic catastrophe, but a slow, insidious, creeping chill. Perhaps the old folks noticed it first. Winters seemed to bite a little deeper and last a little longer. The sea ice lingered stubbornly in the spring. The hay meadows didn't seem quite as lush or tall. It was a subtle shift in the air, a gradual, almost imperceptible tightening of nature's grip across the North Atlantic. We now call this period the Little Ice Age. It wasn't a return to the full glaciation of the deep past, but a significant prolonged cooling trend that affected large parts of the northern hemisphere, lasting in various phases for centuries. For the Norse in Greenland, living at the absolute northernmost edge of European settlement, this little change would have catastrophic consequences. The most immediate and damaging effect was the shortening and cooling of the summers. The already brief window for plant growth began to shrink. Temperatures that were barely adequate before now struggled to rise enough to support robust growth. The vibrant, if fragile, summer green seemed to lose some of its intensity, some of its staying power. Colder summers meant that the vast ice cap and its tributary glaciers didn't melt back as much as they used to. More snow survived from one winter to the next. The overall temperature, even under the 24-hour summer sun, remained lower. This chill seeped into the thin soil, further stunting the growth of grasses and the few hardy plants they relied upon. And as the summers shrank, the winters inevitably expanded their dominion. They became longer, colder, and likely brought heavier, more persistent snowfalls. The period of profound darkness, already a psychological and physical challenge, now felt even more oppressive, stretching out for more weeks, even months. Temperatures plunged lower than their ancestors had known, testing the limits of their turf and stone houses and their dwindling fuel supplies. The cold became a constant, gnawing presence, seeping through walls and spirits alike. This climatic shift struck at the very heart of their existence, the hay harvest. With shorter, cooler summers, the meadows produced less grass. The time available to cut, dry, and store that hay was also reduced. Year after year, the hay barns became harder to fill. What was once barely enough now became critically insufficient. The impact on livestock was inevitable and devastating. Less hay meant less food for the cows, sheep, and goats through the long winter. Animals grew weaker, produced less milk, and yielded poorer wool. Farmers were forced to make impossible choices, slaughtering precious breeding stock to feed their families or watching their herds shrink due to starvation. The very foundation of their farms began to crumble. Any hope of cultivating grain, which was always a marginal activity, evaporated completely. The colder, shorter seasons made growing barley a fool's errand. The small garden plots likely failed more often than not. The agricultural part of their A_grow pastoral system was effectively wiped out, pushing them towards an ever greater and riskier reliance on hunting. The landscape itself began to change in a menacing way. Glaciers, which had been relatively stable or retreating during the warmer period, began to advance. Rivers of ice slowly ground their way further down the valleys, while perhaps not directly overrunning the main settlements. This advance was a visible, terrifying symbol of the cooling world. Pastures near the ice edge may have been lost. Perhaps the most significant change, however, occurred at sea. The cooling climate led to a dramatic increase in sea ice. The storous, heavy drift ice carried down the east coast of Greenland and around the southern tip became much more prevalent and persisted for longer each year. The fjords themselves likely froze over more solidly and for longer periods. This altered ice landscape profoundly affected hunting. Seal migration patterns changed. Access to open water by boat was restricted for much of the year. While hunting at breathing holes on the ice might have become more important, it was also dangerous, and the changing ice conditions made it less predictable. The most reliable food source became harder to tap. Caribou hunting likely suffered too. Colder conditions and potentially deeper snow cover could have affected the herd's numbers and movements. Treks into the highlands became even more hazardous. What was once a reliable supplement became another uncertain gamble in the quest for food. The choking grip of sea ice also tightened around their lifeline to the outside world. The voyage across the North Atlantic, always perilous, became exponentially more so. Ships sailing from Iceland or Norway faced a far greater risk of being trapped or crushed by ice. Navigation became a nightmare. The Denmark Strait, the crucial sea lane between Greenland and Iceland, became clogged with ice for much of the year. Sailing seasons, already short, became virtually non-existent in some years. Ships that once arrived with some regularity now became rare, and eventually they stopped coming altogether. This growing isolation was a slow, creeping disaster, a fading pulse. It meant no new settlers bringing fresh blood and skills, no fresh supplies of essential iron for tools or timber for building and repairs, no news from home, no new priests to lead their churches, and, crucially, no reliable market for their precious walrus ivory and hides. Their only real link to the European economy. They were being cut off, left to face the deepening cold alone, their connection to the wider Norse world slowly, irrevocably severed. Imagine the psychological impact. Generation after generation experienced a world that was palpably getting worse. Summers were shorter, winters harsher, food scarcer, and the ships rarer. It must have felt like a curse. A slow mission abandonment, a shrinking of horizons until only their own cold fjords remained. Hope began to freeze over. Every aspect of life felt the strain. Driftwood, their main source of timber, might have become scarcer as sea ice prevented it from reaching their shores. Keeping houses warm required more fuel, which was harder to find. Maintaining stone and turf structures against deeper frost and heavier snow demanded even more labor. Archaeological evidence paints a grim picture. Skeletons from later periods show signs of increased malnutrition, disease, and hardship. People were, on average, smaller. Evidence suggests a shift towards an almost entirely marine diet in the final years, a desperate reliance on seals as all other options failed. They had no meteorological science, no understanding of planetary climate shifts. They likely interpreted the changing world through the lens of their faith or folklore. Was God punishing them? Had they angered the spirits of the land? They could only observe the effects, the advancing ice, the dwindling herds, the silent seas, and feel a growing sense of dread. The Little Ice Age wasn't a single blow, but a relentless, grinding pressure. It took a society already living on a knife edge and pushed it, millimeter by millimeter, over the brink. It exacerbated every existing challenge: food scarcity, resource limitations, isolation, making adaptation increasingly difficult and eventually impossible. The Western settlement, situated further north and in an even more marginal environment, likely felt the effects first and most severely. Sometime in the mid-14th century, it simply fell silent. The last accounts speak of abandoned farms and no people. It was a chilling foreshadowing of what was to come for the larger Eastern settlement. While other factors, economic shifts in Europe, conflicts with the Inuit, perhaps even disease, played their roles, the Little Ice Age was the inescapable backdrop. It was the changing stage upon which the final act of the Norse Greenland saga played out, a chilling reminder that even the most resilient people can be overwhelmed when the climate itself turns against them. Imagine standing on the shores of Greenland in the 14th century. Look east, across the vast, often ice-choked expanse of the North Atlantic. Beyond the horizon lies Iceland, itself remote, and beyond that Norway, the motherland. In an age of sailing ships and rudimentary navigation, this distance was immense. The Norse Greenlanders were perhaps the most isolated community of European origin anywhere in the world, an outpost clinging to the very edge of the known map. This isolation wasn't just a geographical fact, it was a central reality of their lives. While they strived for self-sufficiency, they were never entirely independent. From the very beginning, their survival and their cultural identity depended on a fragile lifeline, the occasional arrival of ships traversing those thousands of miles of treacherous water. These ships weren't just visitors, they were a connection to everything they weren't. One of the most critical imports was iron. Greenland, for all its rock, held no workable iron ore, nor the vast forests needed to produce the charcoal for smelting. Every axe head, every knife blade, every nail, every sickle, every cauldron, and every spear point had to arrive by ship. Iron was the backbone of their technology, the difference between effective building, farming, and hunting, and a far more primitive existence. As ships became rarer, the scarcity of iron would have been felt keenly. Old tools would be repaired again and again, their metal worn thin. Broken items would be carefully reforged if a smith and precious charcoal were available or repurposed. Eventually, a reliance on stone, bone, and antler tools would increase, a technological step backward, making every task harder and less efficient. Iron became almost as precious as gold. Timber was another desperate need. We've mentioned the lack of local forests, but the need went beyond small fires, for the roofs of their churches, for internal fittings in their longhouses, and most critically for building and repairing seaworthy boats, ocean-going boats. They needed large, strong timbers. Only imports from Norway or perhaps North America via early, unsustained contact could provide these. Without large timber, their world physically shrank. They couldn't build new Norse ships capable of making the journey back to Europe, reinforcing their isolation. Even maintaining their local fishing and hunting boats became a challenge. Buildings had to rely more heavily on stone and turf, becoming damper and perhaps less stable. The lack of wood was a constant, structural weakness in their society. While they subsisted largely on meat and dairy, grain held a special place. Imported barley or wheat, milled into flour, offered the possibility of bread, a taste of home, a dietary staple they deeply missed. Grain was also needed for brewing ale, a crucial element in Norse feasting and social life. And, significantly, wheat bread was essential for the Christian sacrament, the Eucharist. Beyond these essentials, the ships brought goods that maintained their European identity and quality of life: fine woolen cloth in colors they couldn't produce, pottery, glassware, jewelry, Rhenish wine for the church and the elite, metal ornaments, and perhaps even fashionable clothing. These items were markers of status and, more importantly, a reminder that they were part of a wider Christian European world. What could this remote, resource-poor land offer in return? Their primary high-value export was walrus ivory. The long, smooth tusks were highly prized in Europe as a substitute for elephant ivory, carved into luxury items like crucifixes, chess pieces, and decorative boxes. Greenlanders undertook long, dangerous hunting expeditions known as the Nordsetter, far to the north, to procure this precious commodity. Alongside ivory, they traded walrus hides. These were incredibly tough and thick, and when cut into strips, they produced ropes of exceptional strength, highly valued across Europe, particularly for use as rigging on ships. The demand for these vigdar, or hide ropes, provided another crucial trade good. Occasionally, more exotic goods might make the journey. A live polar bear cub, captured and somehow kept alive on the long voyage, was an extraordinary gift fit for a king and commanded an immense price. Arctic falcons, prized for hunting by European nobles, were another potential, if difficult, export. These were high-risk, high-reward ventures. On a more mundane level, they produced vadmo, a standardized, coarse woolen cloth. While useful, it was a low-value commodity, something Iceland also produced in large quantities. It helped fill the cargo holds, but couldn't compete with the allure of ivory. Their export base was narrow, heavily reliant on a single luxury product. Initially, trade might have been relatively open, but by the 13th century it largely fell under the control of the Norwegian crown and the Archbishop of Nidaros. They saw Greenland as part of their realm and sought to control its valuable exports. Royal or church-sanctioned ships made the journey, though private merchants sometimes risked it. It was a regulated, long-distance, and expensive enterprise. We've described the physical dangers of the voyage, but consider the economic risks. A ship had to be built, crewed, and provisioned for a journey that could take weeks or months. It faced storms and ice. Upon arrival, it had to trade goods brought from afar for a cargo, mostly ivory, that then had to survive the perilous return journey before it could be sold. It was a high-risk investment. As the 14th century progressed, the value of walrus ivory began to decline in Europe. Fashions changed, and perhaps more importantly, trade routes reopened, making elephant ivory from Africa more accessible. The core product that made the dangerous Greenlandic voyage economically viable started to lose its luster. The profit margin began to shrink. Europe itself was in turmoil. The Black Death swept across the continent from the mid-14th century, devastating populations, including Norway's. Wars and economic instability shifted priorities. The rise of the Hanseatic League redirected trade flows. Greenland, already peripheral, became increasingly irrelevant to the concerns of a struggling Europe. Norway, their primary connection, was particularly hard hit. The Black Death killed perhaps half its population. It entered into political unions that shifted its focus away from the North Atlantic. Its maritime power declined. The resources and the political will to maintain regular contact with its most distant, least profitable colony simply dwindled away. And all this was happening just as the Little Ice Age was making the journey itself far more dangerous. Increased sea ice meant shorter sailing windows, greater risks of being trapped or crushed, and longer, costlier voyages. Why would a merchant, or a king, risk ships and men for a marginal profit when the journey itself was becoming a frozen nightmare? So the ships came less often. What might have been an annual event became biennial, then perhaps once a decade. Imagine the anticipation each spring, the scanning of the horizon, the hope for sails, and imagine the slow, crushing disappointment as summer after summer passed with no sign. The waiting, the silence, the growing realization that they were being forgotten. Deprived of imports, the Greenlanders had to make do. They relied more heavily on local materials: soapstone for lamps and pots, bone and antler for tools, turf for building. They patched and repaired, recycled every scrap of metal, and likely saw a gradual decline in the quality and complexity of their material culture. Skills like advanced smithing might have been lost. This wasn't just a material loss, it was a cultural one. Without contact, they were cut off from the developments, fashions, and ideas of Europe. Their language likely drifted. Their religious practices, without new priests or guidance, might have become insular or integrated older beliefs. Their very sense of self as part of the Norse world began to fray. There are vague accounts and legends of last ships. A vessel in 1406 driven off course spent several years in Greenland, its crew witnessing weddings and daily life, the last documented contact. After that, silence. Stories of later, perhaps unofficial voyages finding only ruins or no one at all add to the mystery, but the official lifeline was cut. Once the last ship had sailed, Greenland became a world unto itself. A small community of European farmers and hunters, stranded on the edge of the Arctic, forced into complete self-reliance with only their dwindling resources, their memories, and their resilience to sustain them in an increasingly cold and hostile world. Isolation, therefore, was far more than mere loneliness. For the Norse Greenlanders, it was a slow, inexorable process of starvation, a starvation of essential goods, of technology, of information, and of cultural connection. The fraying and final snapping of that fragile supply line across the North Atlantic was a critical wound, one from which this remote outpost would never recover. Beyond the challenges of finding food and building shelter lay an even more fundamental, pervasive struggle for the Norse in Greenland. The simple, relentless battle against the cold. It wasn't just an inconvenience or a seasonal discomfort. It was a constant, life-threatening presence that shaped every decision, every activity, and every moment of their existence. Staying warm wasn't a luxury. It was the primary, unending task. We must understand that Arctic cold isn't merely a low number on a thermometer, it's an active physical force. It's the biting, moisture-sucking wind that seems to cut through any barrier, finding every gap in clothing and shelter. It's the prolonged, profound darkness of winter, where the sun offers no warmth for months on end. It's the deep, penetrating frost that hardens the ground into iron and chills the very stones of their homes. And it's the insidious dampness, carried by fog and sea spray, that makes the cold feel even deeper, settling in bones and resisting all efforts at warmth. Their first and most crucial line of defense was their home, the longhouse. As we've seen, these structures were born of necessity, but their design was intrinsically linked to heat retention. Every feature, from the foundation to the roof, was a strategic move in the ongoing war against the encroaching frost. These weren't just houses, they were fortresses against the cold. The most striking feature was the immense thickness of the walls. Often reaching 6 feet or more, these composite structures of stone and densely packed turf acted as a massive insulating blanket. They slowed the escape of precious indoor heat and blocked the infiltration of the biting wind. The sheer mass of the walls served as a thermal buffer, absorbing any meager heat and releasing it slowly. The houses themselves often presented a low profile to the elements. Many were built into slopes or partially dug into the ground, using the earth itself as an extra layer of insulation and protection from the wind. This subterranean aspect meant they huddled close to the land, almost becoming part of it, minimizing their exposure to the harshest gales. Openings were kept to a minimum. Doorways were low, forcing one to stoop, and often featured internal porches or angled entrances to act as windbreaks. Windows were small, often just slits, likely covered with translucent materials like stretched seal gut or thin hides rather than glass. This preserved heat, but meant the interiors were shrouded in a perpetual twilight, even during the day. Inside, the longhouse was often a series of interconnected rooms. This wasn't just for space, it created a system of heat zones. The innermost rooms, furthest from the outside doors, would be the warmest. Low doorways and perhaps hide hangings between rooms helped to trap warm air and prevent drafts, creating pockets of relative comfort within the larger structure. At the very heart of the longhouse, both literally and figuratively, was the hearth. A long open fire pit often ran down the center of the main room. This provided heat for cooking and a focal point for social life, but with only a small hole in the roof for smoke to escape, these hearths filled the air with acrid smoke, a constant irritant to eyes and lungs. It was a trade-off, warmth for breathable air. Finding fuel for this hearth was a constant, grinding chore. With no forests, they relied on stunted, gnarled birch and willow scrub, painstakingly gathered from sheltered valleys often miles away. Precious driftwood, washed ashore, was a treasured find, hoarded for crucial tasks. But increasingly, they likely turned to less desirable options: dried animal dung, which burned quickly and smokily, and perhaps blubber or oil, burned in simple, effective soapstone lamps. These lamps provided essential light, but only modest, localized heat, and there was rarely enough fuel for true, pervasive warmth throughout the longhouse. A crucial, if unappealing, heating strategy involved their livestock. In many Greenlandic longhouses, the byre, or cowshed, was directly attached to the human living quarters, often separated only by a wall or a passageway. The body heat generated by a dozen sheep or a few precious cows was a significant free source of warmth, helping to raise the ambient temperature of the entire complex, albeit at the cost of air quality. Despite all these efforts, imagine the reality inside. Away from the immediate glow of the hearth, the air would be frigid, cold radiated from the stone walls, dampness seeped up from the earth floors and down from the turf roofs. Frost often formed on the inside walls during the depths of winter. It was a constant, inescapable chill, a far cry from modern notions of indoor comfort. If the house was the first line of defense, clothing was the second, and it was one they carried with them always. What they wore was not a matter of fashion, but of survival. Every garment was designed to trap body heat, repel wind, and, if possible, shed moisture. Their wardrobe was a carefully constructed system of insulation. The cornerstone of their clothing was wool. Sheep were not just a source of milk, they were walking insulation factories. Women spent countless hours shearing, cleaning, carding, spinning, and weaving wool. They produced the thick, durable vadmal cloth, as well as knitting intricate, warm garments like socks, mittens, and hats. Wool production was a vital year-round activity. Wool possesses a remarkable quality. It retains much of its insulating power even when damp. In a climate where staying dry was a constant struggle, this was a lifesaver. By wearing multiple, loose layers of woolen tunics, trousers, and cloaks, they could trap air between the layers, creating a personal microclimate that buffered them against the external cold. But wool alone wasn't enough, especially against wind and water. For outer layers and essential accessories, they turned to the animals they hunted. Furs and hides provided a tougher, more weather-resistant barrier. Seal and caribou were the most important sources, their skins transformed through laborious tanning processes into vital components of their cold-weather gear. Seal skin offered excellent water resistance. It was likely used for outer garments, perhaps anoraks or parkas, though the extent of Inuit influence on their design is debated. Critically, it was used for boots, known as kamits. Keeping feet dry was essential to prevent devastating frostbite, and well-made, oiled sealskin boots were the best defense. Caribou hide offered unparalleled warmth. The hairs of a caribou are hollow, trapping air and creating an incredibly effective insulating layer. These hides were favored for winter parkas, trousers, and, perhaps most importantly, as thick, warm bedding, essential for surviving the long, cold nights on stone or earth sleeping platforms. Protecting the extremities, head, hands, and feet, was absolutely vital. Heat escapes rapidly from these areas, and they are the first to succumb to frostbite. Thick woolen or fur-lined hats and hoods, double-layered mittens, and multiple pairs of woolen socks inside sealskin boots were not optional extras. They were mandatory survival equipment. The key principle was layering. A typical Greenlander might wear an inner linen or fine wool tunic followed by a thicker woolen tunic and trousers, perhaps a knitted woolen sweater, and topped with a fur-lined cloak or parka. This system allowed them to adjust their insulation based on activity and temperature, adding or removing layers as needed. Surviving the night meant conserving heat while inactive. Sleeping platforms were often communal, allowing people to share body heat. These would be covered first with insulating layers of twigs or moss, then topped with thick caribou hides and more hides or woolen blankets for covering. They slept huddled together, cocooned against the darkness. Yet even wrapped in multiple layers of wool and fur inside their thick-walled, earth-hugging houses, the feeling of being truly deeply warm was likely a rare and fleeting luxury, perhaps only felt when huddled close to the smoky hearth. The cold was pervasive. It seeped into their bones during sleep. It made muscles ache and joints stiffen, especially in the old. It was a constant, almost subliminal drain on energy, a background hum of discomfort that defined their physical experience of the world, a chill they could never fully escape. Working outside, whether farming, hunting, or fishing, brought the constant risk of frostbite and hypothermia. Numb fingers and toes, white patches on the skin, these were early warning signs. A sudden storm, an accidental fall into icy water, or simply prolonged exposure could quickly turn lethal. The cold was an ever-present predator. Consider the immense, unceasing effort this all required. The endless work of tending sheep, the laborious process of turning fleece into cloth, the difficult and often smelly task of tanning hides, the constant sewing and mending, the gathering of fuel, the patching of turf walls, all of it, a vast expenditure of energy, simply to keep the cold at bay. Life in Norse Greenland was a relentless thermal equation. It was a constant struggle to find enough food to generate internal body heat while simultaneously expending vast amounts of energy in building, maintaining, and clothing themselves to prevent that precious heat from escaping. It was an exhausting, unending battle waged against the fundamental nature of their frozen world. It's easy to imagine the Norse Greenlanders as a single, homogeneous group, huddled together against the elements, sharing a common fate. But human societies, even small and isolated ones, rarely work that way. Even in the biting winds and frozen landscapes of Greenland, the familiar patterns of social hierarchy, wealth, and power persisted. Life sucked for everyone, but it likely sucked more for some than for others. They carried their social structure with them across the North Atlantic, a blueprint inherited from Norway and Iceland. This was a society built on land ownership, kinship ties, and a clear distinction between leaders and followers. At the top were the chieftains, or big men, known as godar in Iceland, the major landowners and power brokers. Below them were the free farmers, the carls, and at the bottom, potentially, a class of laborers or even thralls. In Greenland, the chieftains were likely the descendants of Eric the Red and the other prominent families who led the initial settlement. They laid claim to the largest and most favorable tracts of land, those sheltered inner fjord locations with the widest hay meadows and easiest access to the sea. Their power stemmed directly from this control over the most vital resource, land. Their farmsteads, like Eric's Brattahlid or the large farms found near the church center at Gardar, stood noticeably apart. Archaeological remains reveal larger, more complex longhouses, sometimes with multiple specialized rooms for living, working, and storage. They featured extensive stone-walled byres capable of housing many cattle and sheep, and vast, well-maintained hayfields. These weren't just farms. They were the nerve centers of economic and social power in the settlements. It wasn't just land. These elite families likely controlled access to other critical resources. They probably organized and led the dangerous but vital Nordsetter hunts for walrus ivory, claiming the lion's share of the profits. They may have asserted rights over stranded whales, or controlled access to the best seal hunting grounds and crucial driftwood collection sites. Crucially, they dominated trade. When the infrequent ships arrived from Europe, it was the chieftains who likely negotiated the exchange. They traded their surplus ivory and hides for the most sought-after imports: iron tools, weapons, timber, fine cloth, and wine. They then controlled the distribution of these scarce goods within the community, reinforcing their status and the dependence of others. Archaeology provides quiet hints of this disparity. At wealthier farm sites, excavators find a higher proportion of imported goods: fragments of Rhenish pottery, shards of glass, metal jewelry, and more numerous iron objects. Even the bones tell a story, sometimes suggesting a diet richer in beef from cattle at elite farms, compared to a heavier reliance on seal for others. Alongside the secular chieftains stood another powerful elite, the church. Greenland was, from the 11th century, a Christian society, and it eventually gained its own bishopric, based at a place called Gardar in the eastern settlement. The bishop and his associated clergy were figures of immense authority, both spiritual and temporal. Gardar was more than just a church. It was a major administrative and economic complex. It boasted a substantial stone cathedral dedicated to St. Nicholas, complete with imported bronze bells and perhaps even primitive stained-glass windows. It had a large bishop's residence, extensive farm buildings, barns, workshops, a tithe barn, and its own dedicated harbor. It was by far the largest and most impressive collection of buildings in Norse Greenland, a visible, enduring symbol of the church's power, wealth, and connection to a wider world. The church amassed considerable wealth through tithes. Every farmer was expected to contribute a portion of their produce: wool, hides, butter, cheese, and perhaps most importantly, walrus ivory. This made the bishopric a major economic force, a significant landowner in its own right, and a key player in the export trade, further concentrating wealth and resources. Far below these elites lived the majority, the common farmers, the carls. They worked their own smaller farms, often on less productive land further from the settlement centers or higher up the slopes. They owned fewer livestock, struggled to produce enough hay, and possessed a smaller buffer against hard times. Their lives were a more direct, unvarnished struggle for subsistence. Their homes were smaller, simpler turf and stone structures. Their belongings were fewer, mostly locally made from bone, soapstone, and wood, with perhaps only a few worn-out iron items. Their diet relied heavily on what they could hunt or catch themselves, primarily seals, supplemented by their small dairy herds. Their existence was far more precarious. And below them still were those who likely owned no land at all: tenant farmers, laborers, servants. These individuals would have worked on the large farms of the chieftains or the church. Their security was even more fragile, entirely dependent on the goodwill and success of their employers. They were the most vulnerable members of this already vulnerable society. This structure created a web of dependence. Poorer farmers needed the chieftains not just for leadership but for access to imported iron, for a chance to participate in large-scale hunts, and perhaps for loans of food or seed during lean years. This dependence came with obligations, loyalty, labor, and a share of any produce or catch. So, while the Little Ice Age brought colder winds for everyone, it didn't blow equally on all houses. The wealthy had larger stores of food and hay. They lived in larger, perhaps slightly warmer longhouses. They owned more woolen clothes and furs. They had reserves. The poor lived much closer to the edge, where a single bad season could spell disaster. Consider the impact of iron scarcity. A chieftain, controlling trade, might still possess a functional axe or knife. A poor farmer, unable to afford imported goods or lacking access, might be forced to rely on inefficient, easily broken tools made of bone or stone. This difference alone would create a huge disparity in productivity and the ability to cope. Diet likely varied too. While everyone ate seals, the elite had better access to beef and mutton from larger herds. They could afford imported grain for bread or porridge and wine for feasts. The poor, especially in later years, likely subsisted almost entirely on marine mammals, a diet potentially lacking in certain nutrients and certainly monotonous. Did these disparities cause open conflict? The sagas, our main narrative source, are full of feuds, often sparked by disputes over land, resources, or honor, issues that undoubtedly had social and economic underpinnings. While Greenlandic sources are scarce, it's reasonable to assume that tensions existed even if muted by the shared struggle for survival. Life, even for the elite, was not luxurious by European standards. The Bishop of Greenland, despite his status, lived a life of considerable hardship compared to his counterparts in Paris or Rome. Yet, within the context of Greenland, the differences were real and significant. They had a degree of security and comfort unimaginable to their poorer neighbors. As the climate worsened and trade dried up, these divisions likely became even starker. The elite, with their larger land holdings and stores, could weather the storms longer. The poor, with no reserves, faced starvation first. The chieftains may have had to support their dependents, stretching their own resources thin, potentially increasing resentment. The chieftains and the bishop faced their own burdens. They held the responsibility for maintaining social order, organizing hunts, and providing spiritual guidance in an increasingly desperate world. But as their own resources dwindled and their connection to Europe faded, their ability to effectively lead must have diminished, perhaps leading to a crisis of authority. What happened in the final decades? Did the social structure break down completely? Did people abandon the larger farms as leaders failed? Or did they huddle closer together, sharing what little they had? Archaeological evidence is ambiguous, but it suggests a gradual impoverishment and shrinking of the population, a fading away where social distinctions might have blurred in the final, desperate years. Nevertheless, for most of the 500 years of Norse Greenland, social stratification was a fact of life. The experience of living and dying in this harsh land was profoundly shaped by where one stood on the social ladder. The cold, the hunger, and the isolation were shared, but the burden was not distributed equally. So when we picture the hardship of Viking Greenland, we shouldn't see a single, uniform struggle. We must imagine a complex society with its own internal dynamics. It's wealthy and it's poor, it's powerful and it's dependent. For many, the undeniable misery of the environment was compounded by the added weight of their social and economic vulnerability. We've journeyed through the biting cold, the gnawing hunger, and the crushing isolation of Norse Greenland. But lurking beneath these visible struggles was an array of unseen enemies, the persistent threats of disease, infection, and the slow decay of the human body in an unforgiving environment. In a world without modern medicine or even a basic understanding of hygiene, staying healthy was perhaps the most challenging battle of all. Consider again the longhouse, the primary shelter. While a fortress against the cold, it was also an incubator for illness. Imagine dozens of people, men, women, children, the elderly, living, eating, sleeping, and working side by side in a confined space for months on end during the long winter. Add to this the presence of livestock often housed within or directly adjacent to the living quarters. The air they breathed would have been thick and heavy. Constant smoke from the open hearth and sputtering soapstone lamps filled the low-ceilinged rooms. Soot would coat the walls, the beams, and a film would settle on every surface. This chronic exposure to smoke inevitably led to respiratory problems, persistent coughs, bronchitis, and an increased vulnerability to more serious lung infections. The lack of light and persistent dampness created further health hazards. Small windows meant little natural sunlight, contributing to low vitamin D levels, which can affect bone health and immune function. The damp conditions, a result of turf walls, earth floors, and melting snow, encouraged the growth of mold and mildew, further irritating lungs and contributing to a generally unhealthy living environment. Sanitation, as we understand it, was virtually non-existent. There were no indoor toilets or running water. Human and animal waste was likely disposed of just outside the longhouse, creating middens or refuse heaps. While practical, these heaps attracted flies and pests and posed a significant risk of contaminating nearby water sources, especially during spring thaws. Their water came from streams and rivers fed by glacial melt. While these sources might seem pristine, they could easily become polluted near the settlements. Runoff from middens, animal enclosures, and areas used for tasks like tanning hides could introduce harmful bacteria into the water, leading to a host of debilitating gastrointestinal illnesses, a constant threat, especially for the young and elderly. Personal hygiene presented immense challenges. Washing oneself or one's woolen clothes required heating water, a task that consumed precious fuel. It's likely that bathing was infrequent, especially in winter. Lice, fleas, and other parasites would have been common companions, adding to the discomfort and potentially spreading diseases like typhus, although its presence isn't confirmed. Preserving food was essential but carried its own risks. Dried, smoked, or fermented foods could still spoil or become contaminated. Eating large quantities of marine mammal meat, sometimes likely consumed raw or lightly cooked to preserve vitamins, carried the risk of infection from parasites like trichinella, which has been found in archaeological remains. As we've seen, the diet was often limited and nutritionally unbalanced. While rich in protein, it lacked variety, especially in fresh plant matter. This led to specific deficiencies. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, would have been a risk during long winters. Rickets, due to low vitamin D, could affect children. Iron deficiency anemia, especially in women, was likely common. The bones of the Norse Greenlanders, carefully studied by archaeologists, tell a silent, often grim story. They reveal evidence of hard physical labor, worn joints, and arthritis. They show signs of iron deficiency, parodic hyperostosis. They indicate periods of childhood illness or malnutrition, Harris lines, and enamohypoplasia. And they show an average life expectancy far lower than today's standards. Tuberculosis was likely a significant killer. This highly contagious bacterial infection thrives in close, poorly ventilated quarters, exactly the conditions found in a longhouse. Skeletal evidence, showing characteristic lesions on vertebrae and ribs, confirms that TB was present and likely widespread, causing chronic illness and eventual death. Pneumonia and other acute respiratory infections would have been common, especially following bouts of cold or flu. In an environment where people were often cold, damp, and potentially malnourished, a simple chest infection could easily prove fatal, with no antibiotics to halt its progress. The smoky indoor air only worsened the risk. In a life filled with manual labor, sharp tools, and interactions with animals, injuries were frequent. A slip of an axe, a fall on icy rock, a bite from a cornered seal, these were everyday risks. Without antiseptics or antibiotics, even a minor cut could become infected. Festering wounds, blood poisoning, sepsis, and gangrene were terrifying and often fatal possibilities. Serious injuries like broken bones posed immense challenges. While the Norse likely had some knowledge of setting fractures using splints, improper healing, chronic pain, and permanent disability were common outcomes. An injury that prevented someone from working could be a death sentence, not just for the individual, but potentially for their dependent family. Dental health was often poor. While they didn't suffer from sugar-induced cavities like modern populations, their diet, containing coarse foods and likely grit from grinding stones, caused significant tooth wear. This exposed the pulp, leading to painful abscesses and infections. Many skeletons show evidence of severe dental problems and tooth loss, sources of constant pain and systemic infection. Childbirth was an exceptionally dangerous time. Without modern obstetric care, complications often proved fatal for both mother and child. Postpartum infections were common. Given the harsh conditions and nutritional stresses, infant and child mortality rates were undoubtedly high, casting a constant shadow of grief over family life. Their medical knowledge was based on tradition, experience, and perhaps a little magic. They would have used local herbs, though Greenland offered few, and folk remedies passed down through generations. Prayers and rituals would have played a role, but they had no concept of germs, sanitation's importance, or the true causes of most illnesses. Healing was often a matter of luck and the body's own resilience. While their isolation might have protected them from some large-scale European epidemics, like the Black Death, though this is debated, they were vulnerable to diseases brought by those few arriving ships, or potentially endemic within their own population. A contagious illness, once introduced, could sweep through a longhouse community with devastating speed. Living so closely with their livestock introduced the risk of zoonotic diseases, illnesses that can jump from animals to humans. Brucellosis from cattle, Q fever, or various parasitic infections were all possibilities, adding another layer of unseen threat to their daily lives. The constant burden of illness, pain, and physical discomfort would have taken a heavy psychological toll. Chronic pain from arthritis or abscessed teeth, the weakness from malnutrition, the constant coughing, and the ever-present fear of infection or injury added to the stresses of cold and hunger. Witnessing children, spouses, and neighbors suffer and die was a regular, painful reality. Degenerative diseases, particularly osteoarthritis, were almost universal among adults, as shown by skeletal remains. Decades of hard physical labor, hauling stones, cutting turf, rowing boats, carrying heavy loads, grinding grain in a cold, damp climate took a heavy toll on joints, leading to chronic pain and reduced mobility in later life. All these factors, malnutrition, chronic infections, parasites, respiratory ailments, and physical stress, created a population with weakened immune systems. They were less able to fight off new infections, less able to recover from injury, and less able to withstand periods of extreme cold or hunger. They were caught in a cycle of poor health. This constant pressure from disease and poor health likely played a significant role in the colony's eventual decline. It wasn't necessarily a single dramatic plague, but rather a slow, grinding attrition, a high death rate, a low birth rate, and a population slowly losing its vitality, its ability to cope with the mounting environmental and economic challenges. Life in Norse Greenland was a relentless negotiation with physical decay. Sickness wasn't an isolated event, it was an ambient condition, a constant presence. The unseen killers, bacteria, viruses, parasites, and the effects of poor nutrition, were as formidable an enemy as the ice and the cold, making survival a daily, often painful struggle against the body's own frailties. As the centuries wore on and the challenges mounted, a fundamental question hangs over the fate of the Norse Greenlanders. Why did they ultimately vanish, while another group of people, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, managed to survive and thrive in the very same, often even harsher, Arctic environment? This question leads us into a complex and often debated area, the story of adaptation, or perhaps the lack of it. We must first introduce these other inhabitants. Sometime after the Norse arrived, a new people began migrating into Greenland from the west, across the Canadian Arctic. These were the Thule people, bearers of a highly sophisticated Arctic-adapted culture and the direct ancestors of today's Inuit. They were masters of a world that the Norse were only struggling to endure. The tools brought with them an ingenious toolkit for Arctic survival. They had swift kayaks for hunting at sea and larger lumiaks for transport. They used dog sleds for winter travel across vast distances. Their hunting weapons, especially the toggling harpoon, were incredibly effective for capturing sea mammals. They could build warm snow houses, igloos for temporary shelter, and knew how to craft layered, perfectly insulated clothing from caribou and seal skin. Contrast this with the Norse. As we've explored, their identity was deeply rooted in Europe. They saw themselves as farmers first and foremost. They were Christians, tied by faith and tradition to a world across the sea. Their social structure, their laws, their very way of thinking was imported from Norway and Iceland. They were North Atlantic people, trying to live on the edge of the Arctic. This European identity manifested most clearly in their dogged insistence on farming. Raising cattle, sheep, and goats was central to their self-image, even though Greenland's environment made it an incredibly marginal and labor-intensive activity. Giving up farming would have meant giving up a core part of who they were, a cultural leap they seemed unwilling or perhaps unable to make. Their dietary preferences reflected this. While they increasingly relied on seals, their ideal meal likely still involved beef or mutton, cheese, butter, and perhaps bread or ale. They valued the products of their farms. Did they look down on a diet based solely on marine mammals? Did the cultural prestige of European food hinder a full embrace of local resources? It's not that the Norse didn't adapt at all. They certainly did. Their heavy reliance on seal hunting, far more than in Iceland or Norway, is clear evidence. Their unique longhouse designs show adaptations to the cold and lack of timber. They were not static, but their adaptations seem to have been within the framework of their existing culture rather than a fundamental shift. The critical question remains, why didn't they adopt more of the clearly superior Arctic survival technologies from their Thule neighbors? There is almost no archaeological evidence that the Norse ever learned to build or use kayaks, or adopted the toggling harpoon, or mastered the art of building snow houses for winter travel. These innovations could have dramatically improved their hunting success and resilience One likely reason lies in cultural barriers. The Norse referred to the indigenous peoples they encountered both in North America and likely Greenland as skreogjar, a term often translated as wretches or barbarians. This suggests a sense of superiority, a prejudice that might have prevented them from seeing the Thule as people to learn from, rather than as alien competitors or inferiors. Evidence of direct contact does exist, but it's tantalizingly scarce. A few Norse artifacts like chainmail fragments or iron tools have been found in Thule sites, and a few Thule items like harpoon heads appear in Norse middens. This implies some interaction, perhaps trade, perhaps scavenging, perhaps conflict, but it doesn't suggest close, cooperative, or long-term exchange of knowledge. The Vinland sagas, recounting Norse encounters in North America, often depict interactions with Skrælingjar as fraught with misunderstanding, mistrust, and eventual violence. While set elsewhere, these attitudes likely reflect the general Norse approach to indigenous peoples and suggest why relations in Greenland might have been distant or hostile rather than collaborative. Competition for resources may also have fueled antagonism. Both groups relied heavily on seals and caribou. They hunted in the same fjords and on the same stretches of coast. As the climate cooled and resources became scarcer during the Little Ice Age, this competition would have intensified, making peaceful coexistence and learning even less likely. There might have been occasional trade. The Norse had iron, the Thule had superior hunting gear, but it seems the crucial step of learning never occurred on a large scale. Intermarriage, a common way for cultures to exchange knowledge and adapt, also seems to have been virtually non-existent, based on current evidence. They lived in the same land, but seemingly in different worlds. The Norse likely possessed a deeply conservative mindset. Their goal wasn't to become Arctic people, it was to remain Norse people in the Arctic. They clung to their European farming practices, their style of dress, heavy wool, their building techniques, and their social structures because these things defined them. To abandon them felt like abandoning their identity. The Church, as a powerful institution, likely reinforced this conservatism. Its focus would have been on maintaining Christian orthodoxy, European traditions, and ties to Rome. Embracing pagan Thule practices or technologies might have been seen as a step away from civilization and faith, actively discouraged by the clergy. Their technology, while advanced, for Europe was fundamentally mismatched with the high Arctic. Woolen clothes are warm but heavy and inefficient when wet compared to layered furs. Their Narships were useless in ice-choked waters. Their longhouses, while impressive, required immense labor and couldn't be built quickly on hunting trips like an igloo. We must remember that for nearly 300 years, their strategy did allow them to survive. During the relatively milder early centuries, their farming, supplemented by hunting, was just enough. They might have seen no urgent, existential need to adopt a completely alien lifestyle. They were coping, until the climate pulled the rug out from under them. The arrival of the Little Ice Age created a perfect storm. It undermined their already marginal farming, and it made their traditional hunting grounds harder to access. And it likely increased conflict with the better adapted Thule over scarcer resources. The window for potential learning and adaptation, if it ever existed, slammed shut. This illustrates the concept of path dependence. The choices made by Eric the Red and the first settlers to establish a European farming colony set the Norse on a particular path. Over centuries, their investments in farms, churches, and a specific way of life made it increasingly difficult, economically and culturally, to change course, even as that path led towards oblivion. Was it stubbornness, pride, ignorance, or simply a profound lack of cultural flexibility? Perhaps they couldn't imagine living like the Thule, or couldn't bring themselves to admit that these wretches actually knew how to survive better than they did. It's a question historians and archaeologists still ponder. It is important to acknowledge the counter-arguments. Some scholars emphasize that the Norse did adapt significantly, becoming primarily marine hunters. They argue that the combination of climate change and the loss of contact with Europe created insurmountable pressures that no society, however adapted, could have withstood without external support or a complete loss of their original identity. One can only wonder what the Thule thought of these strange neighbors. They would have seen them struggling to raise sick-looking cattle, building immense but cold houses, and venturing out in clumsy boats, often ill-equipped for the sea ice. Did they pity them? Fear them? Scorn their inability to learn? We have no written record, only silence. The story of the Greenland Norse serves as a stark, historical, cautionary tale. It speaks to the dangers of cultural rigidity, the potential perils of ignoring local knowledge, and the profound vulnerability of a society, however resilient, when it fails to adapt its core practices in the face of a changing world. Ultimately, their disappearance wasn't just a matter of external forces like climate or isolation. It was deeply intertwined with their internal choices, their cultural identity, and their apparent inability or unwillingness to fully embrace the lessons the Arctic and its existing inhabitants had to offer. It was a fatal clinging to European ways in a world that demanded something entirely different. We arrive now at the final, quiet chapter of our story. The Norse colony in Greenland, after nearly 5 centuries of struggle against ice, isolation, and want, begins to fade from the historical record. There is no thunderous climax, no epic final battle recorded in the sagas. Instead, there is a slow, creeping silence, a gradual disappearance that leaves behind only ruins and an enduring, haunting mystery. The first whispers of this end came from the north. The western settlement, always more marginal, smaller, and colder than its eastern counterpart, seems to have succumbed first. By the mid-14th century, accounts suggest it was already in deep trouble, its connection to the eastern settlement becoming frayed. Around 1360, a priest named Ivar Bardason, who had served in Greenland, wrote a description of the land. He claimed to have visited the western settlement and found it utterly deserted. He described finding no people, neither Christian nor pagan, only wild cattle and sheep roaming among abandoned farms. It's a chilling image, a silent landscape where human life had simply stopped. Whether Bardason's account is entirely accurate or embellished, it points to the collapse of the western settlement. The reasons were likely an intensified version of the pressures felt everywhere. A harsher climate, failed farming, perhaps increased conflict or competition with the Thule, and its extreme isolation. Its demise left the eastern settlement alone, a solitary outpost facing a darkening future. Yet life in the eastern settlement continued, at least for a while. Our last tantalizing glimpse into this fading world comes from a most mundane source, a church record. In September of 1408, a wedding took place at the Havalsi Church, arguably the best-preserved Norse ruin in Greenland today. The marriage was between Sigrid Bjornsdotter and Thorstein Olafsson, both Icelanders. These Icelanders had been part of a ship blown off course, landing in Greenland in 1406. They remained there for 4 years, and their presence, documented in letters they carried back to Iceland and Norway in 1410, provides our very last, definitive written record of the Norse Greenlanders. It tells us that in 1408, society still functioned, churches operated, laws were followed, and life events were celebrated. But after 1410, when that ship sailed away, an impenetrable silence descends. No more letters arrived in Europe, no more ships braved the icy passage, no further records mention the Greenlanders. It is as if a curtain was drawn across the North Atlantic, hiding the final act of this long drama from history's view. For centuries, no one in Europe truly knew what happened next. Archaeology suggests that this silence fell upon a community already in decline. Studies of farm sites indicate that many of the smaller, more marginal farms were abandoned long before the 15th century. The population appears to have been shrinking, concentrating in the larger core areas like Britalid and Gardar, but even these were likely under immense strain. This points towards a gradual fading rather than a sudden catastrophe. It wasn't a single event, like a devastating plague or a final, overwhelming attack. It was likely a slow, painful process of attrition, unfolding over decades, a community shrinking year by year, death by death, until it simply lacked the critical mass to sustain itself. What tipped them over the edge? Starvation is a prime suspect. As the climate cooled and hunting became harder, their fragile food supply would have dwindled further. Skeletons show evidence of severe malnutrition in the later periods. Imagine the final winters, the larders empty, the sea frozen, and hope dying along with the last embers in the hearth. The relentless cold itself could have been a killer. As resources like fuel became scarcer and with bodies weakened by hunger, the ability to withstand the long, dark winters diminished. Hypothermia, frostbite leading to fatal infections, these would have become increasingly common. Perhaps, in the end, some simply lay down in their cold houses and never got up again. Conflict cannot be entirely ruled out. While a full-scale war with the Thule seems unlikely, increasing competition for scarce resources could have led to skirmishes, raids, and a constant state of low-level hostility. Isolated farmers or hunting parties might have been picked off, further weakening the beleaguered community. While a single, massive plague seems unlikely given the lack of evidence in isolation, endemic diseases, as we've discussed, would have taken their toll. A weakened population is highly susceptible, a final outbreak of influenza or another respiratory illness, in a community with no immunity and no medical care, could have been the final straw for a small, struggling group. Did some try to leave? It's a compelling thought. Faced with inevitable decline, did some Greenlanders attempt the desperate gamble of sailing back to Iceland or Norway? They lacked large timbers to build sturdy ships, and the journey was more perilous than ever. Any such attempts, made in small, inadequate boats, likely ended in the icy depths of the Atlantic. Could some have gone native, abandoning their Norse ways and joining Thule communities? While romantic, there is little concrete evidence for this. No Norse DNA has been found in modern Inuit populations, and few European traits appear in Thule archaeology. While individual instances might have occurred, large-scale assimilation seems improbable given the likely cultural barriers. Perhaps the most likely scenario involves a concept known as the Endling effect. The population simply shrank below a viable threshold. With too few people, especially young women, births couldn't keep pace with deaths. Essential communal tasks like large hunts or maintaining churches became impossible. Society slowly unraveled, losing its structure, its knowledge, and its will to survive. Why was there no attempt at rescue or recontact from Europe? As we've seen, Norway was weak, trade routes had shifted, Greenland offered little profit, and the journey was incredibly risky. They were, quite simply, too far away and too forgotten. Europe had its own problems, and the fate of a few hundred people on a frozen island was a low priority. When European ships, mostly whalers and explorers, began tentatively returning to Greenlandic waters in the 16th and 17th centuries, they found a changed world. English explorer John Davis, in the 1580s, reported finding ruins and signs of savages, the Inuit, but no trace of any Norse people. The silence had become permanent. It wasn't until 1721 that a concerted effort was made. Hans Egede, a Dun-Norwegian missionary, sailed to Greenland, driven by a desire to re-establish contact and minister to what he assumed were surviving Norse Catholics. Instead, he found only the Inuit people and the enigmatic crumbling ruins of stone and turf, confirming that the European colony had vanished entirely. Those ruins, the Volsi church walls standing stark against the sky, the green mounds outlining the bishop's seat at Gardar, the foundations of Eric's farm at Brattahlid, are all that remain. They are silent testaments to 5 centuries of endurance, adaptation, and eventual failure. They whisper stories of a lost world, swallowed by time and ice. The enduring power of the Norse Greenland story lies in its mystery. Because there were no chroniclers in those final decades, we don't know exactly how it ended. Was it a slow, starving freeze, a final desperate voyage, a quiet assimilation? Archaeology provides clues, but no definitive answers. The silence allows for speculation, for imagining those last days. The tale serves as a somber lesson, echoing across the centuries, particularly in our own era of climate concerns. It speaks of the limits of resilience, the dangers of cultural inflexibility, the critical importance of adaptation, and the profound impact that environmental change can have, especially on societies living at the very edge. But beneath the academic debates and historical lessons, we should remember the human element. These were real people with hopes, fears, families, and beliefs. Imagine the last Greenlander, perhaps an old woman, sitting in a cold, smoky longhouse watching the fire die, knowing the ships would never return and understanding that their world, everything they knew, was coming to an end. It's a profound, quiet tragedy. And so, the Norse Greenlanders fade from our view, slipping back into the Arctic mists. Their 500-year saga ends not with a bang, but with a long, drawn-out whisper. It's a story of ambition, endurance, hardship, and ultimately, disappearance. A dull, perhaps, but deeply poignant piece of forgotten history, perfect for quiet reflection as we too drift toward silence. And so, our long, quiet journey through the icy fjords and forgotten farmsteads of Norse Greenland draws to its inevitable close. We have sailed across treacherous seas in open boats, huddled within the smoky confines of turf longhouses, felt the gnawing pangs of persistent hunger, and listened as the silence from Europe deepened over the cold waters. We set out to ask why it sucked to be a Viking in Greenland, and now, as we prepare for slumber, let us gently gather these historical threads and reflect upon the quiet, yet profound lessons left behind in the ice. It began, as many human endeavors do, with a dream. A dream sold by Eric the Red, a dream of green pastures and a fresh start, far from the troubles of Iceland. It was a powerful vision, strong enough to convince hundreds of people to risk everything, to pack their lives onto small wooden ships and sail towards an unknown horizon. But almost immediately, the dream collided with a stark frozen reality. The Greenland was but a thin, fragile ribbon clinging to the edges of an immense ice sheet. The soil was thin, the summers fleeting, and the winters long and profoundly dark. From the very first day, survival in Greenland was an uphill battle. We remember the journey itself, a brutal filter that claimed many lives before they even saw their new home. And we remember the immense, back-breaking toil of those who arrived, hauling stones, cutting turf, building shelters with their bare hands, wringing a living from a land that yielded its resources only grudgingly. Every structure, every field, was a monument to their sweat. We've felt the constant anxiety of the food crisis, the desperate hope invested in meager hay harvests, the vulnerability of their precious livestock, and the growing, necessary reliance on the dangerous hunt. Seals became their lifeblood, yet even this resource was subject to the whims of ice and weather, offering no true, lasting security. We've shivered with them, recalling the pervasive, bone-deep cold. We've seen how they layered wool and fur, how they built thick-walled homes burrowed into the earth, and how they shared warmth with their animals. Yet we understand that true warmth was a rare luxury, and the battle against frostbite and hypothermia was an endless, exhausting campaign. We've felt the profound weight of their isolation. We watched as the ships from Europe became rarer, the lifelines stretched thin by storms, ice, and waning interests. We imagined the silence growing, the sense of abandonment deepening, as they realized they were truly alone, adrift at the very edge of their world. We've considered the unseen enemies, the bacteria and viruses thriving in cramped, smoky longhouses, the chronic aches of arthritis from hard labor, the weakness born of malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies. We've seen how physical decay was as much a threat as any blizzard or empty larder. We've witnessed the immense power of climate change as the little ice age slowly, relentlessly tightened its grip. The cooling climate wasn't a sudden shock, but a gradual strangulation, making every aspect of their already difficult lives just a little bit harder, until hard became impossible. And we've pondered their cultural choices, their stubborn adherence to a European farming model, their apparent reluctance to fully embrace the proven survival strategies of their Thule neighbors. Was it pride, prejudice, or simply a deep-seated need to remain who they were, even when it doomed them? So why did it suck? It sucked because it was a relentless accumulation of hardships. It was the combination of brutal cold, limited food, backblacking labor, profound isolation, endemic disease, and a changing climate. There was no single enemy to fight, but 1,000 small, grinding pressures, pushing down day after day, year after year. Yet, in this catalog of misery, we must acknowledge their incredible resilience. They didn't just arrive and die, they persisted for 500 years. They built farms and churches, raised families, developed a unique culture, and endured conditions that most would find unimaginable. Their story is also a testament to human toughness and the will to survive. But it is also a story of fragility. It shows us that even the most resilient people, the inheritors of the fierce Viking spirit, have their limits. It reminds us that human societies exist within ecological boundaries, and when those boundaries shift, or when we fail to adapt, even the strongest can be broken. Their ending wasn't one of fire and glory, not a saga-withery clash against overwhelming odds that bards would sing about for generations. It was a slow, almost imperceptible fade. A dwindling population, abandoned farms becoming green mounds, a final recorded wedding, and then an overwhelming silence. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible disappearance, a retreat into the mists of history, which is perhaps the most unsettling, most dull, and yet most human end of all. It's a stark lesson in the indifference of nature. The ice advanced, the seas froze, and the storms raged, not out of malice, but simply because the planet's systems were changing. The Norse tried to impose their will upon Greenland, but Greenland, in its vast, slow power, ultimately imposed its will upon them. Their own stubbornness was both their greatest strength and their fatal flaw. The same determination that drove them across the Atlantic and allowed them to build a life in Greenland also, perhaps, prevented them from making the radical changes needed to survive when conditions worsened. They were trapped by their own identity. In a world once again grappling with the profound impacts of a changing climate, the quiet story of the Greenland Norse offers echoes we cannot ignore. It prompts us to think about adaptation, about resilience, about cultural choices, and about the long-term consequences of how we choose to live upon this planet. Sometimes, the most profound history isn't found in the clamor of great battles or the intrigue of royal courts, but in these dull stories of slow struggle, gradual adaptation, and quiet decline. They reveal the fundamental challenges of human existence, the slow, grinding realities of weather, hunger, work, and community that shape lives far more than most dramatic events. They offer a deep, if somber perspective, a chance to contemplate the very essence of endurance. As you lie in your bed now, perhaps feeling the gentle weight of your blankets and the warmth and comfort around you, try to imagine that growing silence in Greenland. Picture the last few families, huddled together in their turf houses, rationing the last of the dried seal meat, looking out at a landscape that no longer offered hope. Hear the wind whistling through the empty stone arches of Elsie Church. Feel the slow, cold approach of the inevitable, the quiet end of a 500-year dream. Let these thoughts not disturb your rest, but rather let them provide a backdrop of deep, quiet history. Allow the immense scale of time and the distant, silent struggles of those long-ago people help to diminish the urgency of today's worries. Let the story of their hardship ease you towards the peace of sleep, a release they perhaps longed for but rarely found so easily. Let the dullness be a comfort. So, as you seek slumber, let the whispers of Greenland's icy winds carry a cautionary tale. Sometimes, the greatest adventures end not with a bang, but with a quiet, frozen whimper. Remember the silent, grinding struggle of those who dared to settle an unforgiving land and, perhaps, fail. And as you drift off, may your own bed feel remarkably warm and comfortable. May you appreciate the simple, often overlooked comforts of your own time and place, a world away from the relentless cold and hardship faced by those Vikings on the edge of the world. Thank you for joining us on this quiet expedition into the dull, deep corners of history. We hope this journey into Greenland's forgotten saga has helped to quiet your mind and prepare you for a night of peaceful rest. We appreciate you listening tonight, sharing this space with us. It's through these quiet explorations that we connect with the past and perhaps understand ourselves a little better. Until next time, may your dreams be calm, may the winds in your world be gentle, and may your sleep be deep, untroubled, and wonderfully restorative. Good night.